Dorea, one of the first and most powerful shifts that actually disrupts an avoidance emotional pattern is when your emotional availability is no longer something they can rely on at will. Because for a long time in most of these dynamics, there's an unspoken structure in place. You are emotionally present. You respond. You explain. You soften the silence. You fill the gaps. And without realizing it, you become the stabilizing force in a connection that is otherwise inconsistent. To the avoidant mind, that stability is comfortable, but it also becomes something they don't have to think about. Your emotional presence becomes predictable. And predictability in this context removes urgency. If something is always available, the mind does not feel compelled to process its value in real time. But something very different happens when that availability disappears. Not in a dramatic way, not through conflict, not through emotional reaction, but through calm withdrawal of access. You stop over-explaining yourself. You stop immediately responding to emotional distance. You stop trying to bridge every gap they create. And most importantly, you stop offering emotional regulation for their inconsolable. Tensy. What you are actually doing in that moment is removing the safety net. And this is where psychology becomes very clear. Avoidance is not the absence of feeling. It is the management of feeling without direct engagement. So when the external structure that allowed that management disappears, the internal system has no choice but to respond differently. At first, what they feel is not clarity, it is discomfort, a subtle unease, a sense that something familiar is no longer stable. But because avoidant patterns are built on minimizing emotional intensity, that discomfort doesn't immediately translate into insight. It often shows up as confusion, irritation, or even dismissal. But underneath all of that, something deeper is beginning to surface, because your emotional unavailability changes the entire reference point of the connection. You are no longer just there in the background. You are no longer something they can return to without consequence. You are no longer a constant. And the human mind is structured in such a way that it only fully evaluates value when access becomes uncertain. This is where emotional contrast begins to form. They start to notice not just your presence, SE, but the absence of your presence. Not just your responses, but the lack of them. And in that contrast, their internal system begins to register something it had previously bypassed: emotional significance. Now here's the deeper layer most people miss. Avoidants don't process emotional significance in real time when everything feels stable. They process it when stability is disrupted, because disruption forces attention. And attention is what breaks emotional avoidance. When you are no longer emotionally available in the same way, they are forced into a position they usually avoid sitting with: uncertainty. And uncertainty is psychologically uncomfortable, but it is also revealing. It strips away assumption. It removes autopilot connection. It interrupts the narrative that this person will always be there no matter how I show up. And in that interruption, something very important begins to emerge. Awareness of attachment, not expressed, not articulated, but internally recognized. They begin to feel the difference between having you available and not having you available. And that difference is where emotional recognition begins to form. Because you cannot miss what you have never. Even more valuable, but you also cannot ignore what suddenly feels less accessible than before. This is why emotional availability, when removed calmly and consistently, becomes such a powerful catalyst. It does not create emotion, it reveals what was already underneath the surface but never fully acknowledged. And once that recognition starts, it cannot be completely reversed. It may be resisted. It may be suppressed again, but it has already been seen. And in psychological terms, what has been seen can no longer be completely unseen. That is the moment the dynamic changes. Not because you chased harder, but because you stopped being the constant that allowed avoidance to remain unchallenged. And in that silence, something finally begins to wake up. Because when emotional access disappears, emotional awareness begins. Once that emotional availability is no longer predictable, the next layer that begins to break down is control. Because in avoidant dynamics, control is not just about behavior, it's about emotional timing, distance, and access. They are often most comfortable when they can regulate the rhythm of the connection. They decide when to engage, when to withdraw, when to reappear, and how much of themselves to reveal at any given moment. That rhythm creates a sense of psychological safety for them because nothing ever fully overwhelms them. Everything is spaced out, contained, manageable. But the moment you stop syncing yourself to that rhythm, something fundamental shifts. When you no longer respond in predictable emotional patterns, when you no longer rush to repair every gap, when you no longer react instantly to their withdrawal, you interrupt the system they were using to stay in control of the emotional distance between you. And that interruption creates instability, not external chaos, but internal uncertainty. Because now their usual assumptions no longer work. They pull away, and instead of immediate pursuit, there is space. They re-engage inconsistently, and instead of emotional reassurance, there is neutrality or boundaries. They test the dynamic, and instead of predictable emotional feedback, there is something unfamiliar. Self-direction. This is where the psychology becomes very interesting. Avoidants are not just avoiding intimacy, they are managing predictability. When the emotional environment becomes too predictable, they disengage. But when the presence too unpredictable, they become activated, and loss of control creates unpredictability. Now, this does not mean chaos. It does not mean emotional games or retaliation. In fact, the most powerful shift happens when your behavior becomes calm, grounded, and consistent, but no longer reactive to their emotional timing. That is what breaks the pattern. Because from their perspective, the emotional map they were using no longer matches reality. They expect a certain response and they don't get it. They expect access and they don't receive it on demand. They expect emotional movement toward them, and instead they encounter boundaries. And when expectations repeatedly fail, the mind is forced to update its understanding of the connection. At first, this creates friction. They may interpret it as distance, disinterest, or even confusion. But underneath those surface interpretations, something deeper is happening. They are losing the ability to control emotional proximity. And when control over proximity is lost, emotional awareness starts to surface in ways it was previously suppressed. Because control was not just a preference, it was a buffer. It allowed them to engage without fall. 3, align, confronting the emotional weight of the connection. It allowed them to step in and out without consequence. It allowed them to stay connected without vulnerability. But when that buffer is gone, the emotional experience becomes more direct. Now they are no longer just interacting with you, they are experiencing the effects of your absence and presence without predictable structure. And that unpredictability forces reflection. They start to notice things they didn't register before. The discomfort of your silence, the significance of your boundaries, the difference between having access and not having it. And most importantly, the internal reaction they can no longer fully regulate. This is where emotional control begins to shift from external to internal, because when they can no longer control the dynamic, they are forced to confront what the dynamic is actually doing to them. And that confrontation is where suppressed feelings begin to surface, not as declarations, but as internal awareness. A sense of unease, a pull toward clarity, a recognition that something meaningful is no longer as accessible as it once was. And here is the key truth beneath it all. Control does not prevent feeling. It only delays it. So when control is removed, even gradually, what was delayed begins to appear. And in that moment, the dynamic is no longer about managing distance. It becomes about facing what distance actually means. Because when control disappears, truth has no choice but to surface. Once emotional availability is no longer predictable and control over the dynamic starts to dissolve, there is another shift that often determines whether real emotional awareness begins to emerge, and that is where your focus actually lives. Because for a long time in these dynamics, something subtle happens. Without even noticing it, your attention begins to orbit around the other person. You start tracking their responses, analyzing their silence, interpreting their behavior, trying to decode meaning from distance. Your emotional world slowly begins to revolve around their availability, their inconsistency, their timing. And when that happens, the connection becomes unbalanced in a very specific way. Not necessarily in effort, but in energy. Because your internal state becomes reactive. It rises and falls based on their behavior. When they engage, you feel momentum. When they withdraw, you feel uncertainty. When they reappear, you feel relief. And over time, this creates a silent dependency, not of action, but of emotional orientation. Now, here is where the psychological shift becomes powerful. Avoidant individuals often operate with an unconscious awareness of this dynamic. Even if they cannot articulate it, they feel when someone's emotional focus is heavily directed toward them. And in many cases, that focus becomes part of what allows them to stay distant. Because as long as they are the center of your emotional attention, they don't have to move toward you. They already occupy space in your internal world. But something very different happens when that orientation changes. When your focus begins to shift back toward yourself, your goals, your structure, your growth, your life, the entire emotional geometry of the connection changes. You are no longer orbiting them. You are no longer waiting in emotional suspension. You are no longer organizing your internal world around their behavior. Instead, you become centered in your own direction again. And this shift is not about pretending to move on. It is not about performance. It is not about trying to provoke action. It is a genuine redirection of attention. And that authenticity is what makes it powerful. Because energy that is no longer attached to chasing or waiting has a different quality. It becomes grounded. It becomes stable. It becomes self-contained. And that kind of energy is not easily ignored. From the avoidant perspective, this creates a new kind of emotional experience. They no longer feel like they are the focal point of your emotional world. They no longer sense constant availability. They no longer experience your attention as something that automatically adjusts to their presence or absence. And this introduces contrast, because now instead of feeling like they are at the center of your emotional attention, they begin to sense your independence, your movement, your direction, your life existing outside of their participation. And that contrast activates something very important: curiosity. Not forced curiosity, not manufactured curiosity, but a natural psychological response to something that is no longer predictable. The mind is drawn toward what it cannot fully map. And when someone who was once emotionally oriented toward you becomes oriented elsewhere, it disrupts, asks assumptions. It creates questions. It introduces a subtle sense of disconnection from what was previously taken for granted. They begin to wonder what has changed, not just in behavior, but in internal state, not just in presence, but in priority. And beneath that curiosity, there is often a deeper recognition forming that your emotional world no longer depends on their participation. And that recognition carries weight because it shifts the perceived dynamic from attachment to autonomy. And autonomy, especially in emotional relationships, changes value perception. What is no longer dependent becomes more distinct. What is no longer accessible on demand becomes more noticeable. What is no longer centered around them becomes something they have to mentally reevaluate. This is where emotional awareness starts to emerge, not because you demanded attention, but because you stopped needing it. And in that space, something subtle but profound happens. They begin to experience your absence not just as distance, but as contrast against your independence. And that contrast is what begins to awaken reflection, because people don't always realize what something meant to them when it was entered around them. They realize it when that center shifts. And when your attention returns to your own life, their awareness of your value finally begins to return to you. When your focus shifts back to your own life, something else begins to happen almost simultaneously, something that most people underestimate in its emotional power. The idea of loss stops being theoretical and starts becoming real. Because until this point, there is usually an underlying assumption in avoidant dynamics that the connection is stable enough to return to, even if it goes quiet, even if there is distance, even if there is inconsistency. There is often an unconscious belief that the other person will remain emotionally accessible in some form. And that assumption is what allows avoidance to continue without urgency. But when your behavior changes in a way that is consistent, grounded, and self-directed, that assumption begins to weaken. Not through words, but through experience. You are no longer responding in the same emotional patterns. You are no longer readily available in the same way. You are no longer adjusting your life around the connection. And that creates a new kind of psychological reality. Reality. Now, they are not just observing distance, they are sensing possibility of separation. And that is a very different emotional category, because distance can be temporary. But loss introduces finality. At first, this doesn't always register consciously. It may show up as subtle discomfort, increased curiosity, or a sense that something has shifted without being fully understood. The mind tries to interpret it through familiar frameworks. They are busy, they are pulling back, they are focusing on themselves. But as consistency in your behavior continues, those explanations start to lose strength. Because what they are experiencing is not just less attention is less emotional availability tied to expectation of return. And that begins to activate a deeper psychological process, valuation under uncertainty. Human beings do not fully evaluate what something means to them while it feels guaranteed. We evaluate it when access becomes uncertain, when availability is no longer assumed, when the emotional structure we relied on is no longer stable. This is where emotional awareness begins to deepen. They start to notice your absence differently, not just as silence, but as something that now carries consequence. They begin to register the fact that interactions are not automatically resuming, that emotional familiarity is not being reestablished on demand, that your presence is no longer something they can casually re-enter without reflection. And in that space, something important begins to surface: emotional relevance. Because when someone is consistently present, they become background. But when their presence becomes uncertain, they move into focus. Now, this is where the mind begins to do something very revealing. It starts replaying interactions. It starts revisiting moments of connection. It starts comparing the current absence with the previous emotional access. Not because they are told to, but because the system is trying to resolve uncertainty. And in that comparison, emotional significance becomes clearer. What was once taken for granted begins to stand out. The consistency you provided, the emotional safety you offered, the ease of connection that existed before distance entered the dynamic, all of it becomes more visible in contrast to your current absence. But here is the key distinction. This realization is not created by effort. It is regarding. It's revealed by contrast. And contrast only exists when something changes. If everything remains predictable, nothing is evaluated deeply. But when predictability breaks, the mind is forced to reassess value, meaning, and emotional importance. And this reassessment is where the fear of loss begins to take shape, not as panic, but as awareness. A quiet recognition that the connection is no longer in the same state it once was. That access is no longer automatic. That emotional presence is no longer guaranteed. And once that recognition enters the system, it cannot be completely ignored, because now every interaction or lack of interaction carries weight. Every silence has meaning. Every distance has implication. And this is the moment where emotional detachment starts to lose its illusion of safety, because it is no longer cost-free. Because when loss becomes real, emotional awareness becomes unavoidable. When the possibility of loss starts to become real, something very subtle but extremely important happens in the emotional system of the connection. The pressure begins to disappear. Now, when we talk about pressure in this context, we are not talking about aggression or conflict. We are already talking about emotional weight. The unspoken expectation that the connection must move somewhere, that clarity must be reached quickly, that reassurance must be given, that uncertainty must be resolved immediately. In many relationships with avoidant dynamics, even unspoken emotional expectation can feel like pressure, not because it is wrong, but because it creates a sense of demand for emotional presence that feels too fast, too intense, or too consuming for someone who is wired to regulate closeness carefully. So what often happens is a push-pull effect. The more expectation is felt, the more withdrawal occurs. The more urgency is introduced, the more distance is created. And this cycle continues because both people are trying to stabilize something that is already emotionally unbalanced. But when you step out of that cycle, when you stop pushing for immediate clarity, when you stop seeking reassurance as a way to regulate uncertainty, when you stop reacting emotionally to every shift in their behavior, something important begins to change. You remove the pressure, not by disconnecting emotionally in a cold or indifferent way, but by no longer attaching urgency to the outcome. Oh, F the connection. You begin to allow space. You allow time. You allow the dynamic to exist without forcing it into resolution. And in that space, defensiveness starts to soften, because defensiveness is almost always a response to perceived emotional demand. When someone feels that they are expected to respond in a certain way, they are expected to respond in a certain way, at a certain speed, or with a certain level of emotional depth before they are ready. The natural response is to protect themselves, to withdraw, to shut down, to create distance in order to regain internal stability. But when that perceived demand is no longer present, the internal system no longer needs to defend itself in the same way. And this is where something very interesting begins to unfold. Without pressure, emotional interaction starts to feel less like obligation and more like choice. There is no longer a sense that every interaction must lead somewhere immediately. There is no longer a sense that silence must be filled. There is no longer a sense that emotional discomfort must be resolved in real time. Instead, there is space for experience. And space changes everything. Because in space, emotions that were previously suppressed or controlled begin to surface naturally. Not because they are being forced out, but because they are no longer being actively pushed down by tension. For an avoidant individual, this is especially significant, because much of their emotional regulation strategy is built around managing intensity. When intensity drops, internal defenses also begin to relax. And in that relaxation, something begins to emerge that was previously inaccessible. Unfiltered emotional awareness. They may not immediately understand what they are feeling. In fact, it often begins as a vague sense of discomfort, curiosity, or emotional restlessness. But over time, as the pressure remains absent and the space remains open, those feelings start to organize themselves. And what starts to become clearer is not just the presence of emotion, but its direction. They begin to notice what feels different about your absence compared to your presence under pressure. They begin to feel the contrast between emotional demand and emotional space. And in that contrast, a deeper recognition starts to form. Connection feels different when it is not being forced. This is where real emotional openness can begin to emerge, because people do not open up deeply when they feel pressured to do so. They open up when they feel safe enough not to be rushed. And safety in this context is not about certainty. It is about the absence of urgency. When urgency is removed, the emotional system is no longer in survival mode. It shifts into reflection mode. And in reflection, awareness becomes possible. And once awareness begins, it becomes very difficult to fully return to the previous level of emotional avoidance. Because now the system has experienced connection without pressure, and that contrast cannot be unseen. Because when pressure disappears, emotional truth finally has the space to reveal itself. When pressure disappears and space replaces urgency, there is one final stage that often determines whether true emotional awareness fully emerges, and that is what happens when the person is left alone with themselves. Because ultimately, every external dynamic is only one layer of the experience. The deeper layer is always internal. And for someone with avoidant tendencies, the external relationship often functions as a kind of buffer, something that helps regulate internal discomfort without requiring full emotional confrontation. And distraction, distance, intermittent connection, emotional control, all of these are ways of managing what is happening internally without having to sit with it directly for too long. But when your presence no longer fills the gaps in the same way, when the connection is no longer constantly being stabilized from the outside, something changes in the internal landscape. Silence becomes louder, not external silence, but internal silence. The absence of emotional noise that was previously directed outward begins to turn inward. And in that inward space, patterns start to surface that were previously easy to bypass. Thoughts that were avoided begin to repeat. Emotional reactions that were minimized begin to linger. Questions that were postponed begin to return. And this is where self-confrontation quietly begins. Not in a dramatic way, not as an immediate emotional breakdown or sudden realization, but as a gradual awareness that something within the internal system is no longer being fully avoided. Because when there is no longer constant external engagement to regulate emotional state, the individual is left with their own processing. And that processing cannot always remain controlled. The mind starts to revisit moments in the connection. Not just what happened, but how it felt. The absence of your emotional presence becomes more noticeable, not because it is being highlighted, but because it is no longer being balanced by consistent interaction. And in that imbalance, reflection begins. They may start to recognize patterns in themselves they previously justified or overlooked. The tendency to withdraw, the difficulty in staying emotionally present, the impact of inconsistency on the connection. These realizations do not always arrive as judgments. Often they arrive as quiet recognition and internal acknowledgement that something is repeating. And repetition is what forces awareness. Because when the same emotional outcomes keep appearing across different moments, the mind eventually begins to question the pattern rather than the situation. This is where the most important shift happens. They begin to understand that what they are experiencing is not just about the connection with Yuet, is also about how they engage with connection in general. And that realization moves the dynamic from external focus to internal reflection. At that point, the absence of dist, refraction, becomes significant. Because without external regulation, there is no immediate escape from internal patterns. And in that space, emotional truth becomes harder to suppress. This does not automatically lead to change. Awareness alone does not guarantee transformation, but it creates the conditions for it. Because once something is seen clearly enough, it cannot remain entirely unconscious anymore. And that is the real turning point. Not when someone reacts to you, not when they reach out, not when they express emotion, but when they begin to see themselves within the pattern of the connection. Because that is when responsibility enters the picture. That is when reflection deepens. That is when emotional avoidance stops being effortless. And whether they move toward growth, toward reconnection, or toward further distance, the key difference is this: they are no longer unaware. They are no longer operating blindly within the same emotional cycle. They are seeing it. And once a pattern is seen clearly, it begins to shape every future decision, whether consciously or unconsciously, because when someone is finally left alone with themselves, they don't just miss you, they meet the truth they've been avoiding all along. When you bring everything together, a clear psychological truth emerges underneath all of this. What finally forces an avoidant to get in touch with their true feelings is not pursuit, not pressure, and not emotional intensity. It is the removal of everything that allowed avoidance to function in the first place. When emotional availability disappears, awareness begins. When control is disrupted, truth starts to surface. When your focus returns to your own life, the emotional balance shifts. When the fear of losing you becomes real, reflection is triggered. When pressure is removed, emotional space opens. And when all external buffers are gone, they are left alone with themselves and their patterns. And in that space, something unavoidable happens. They are no longer just interacting with you. They are confronting what your presence meant in their life and what your absence now reveals. But here is the deeper truth that sits beneath all of this. This process is never really just about them. It is about you stepping out of a dynamic where your emotional stability depended on inconsistency. It is about no longer chasing clarity from someone who, cannot give it while they are avoiding themselves. It is about reclaiming your focus, your energy, and your sense of direction. Because the moment you stop trying to force understanding from them is the moment you begin to build it within yourself. And that changes everything. You stop waiting for signs. You stop overinterpreting silence. You stop measuring your worth through their distance or their return. And instead you become anchored in your own life, your own growth, your own emotional clarity. And here is what most people miss. When you are no longer trying to be chosen, you naturally become more grounded, more centered, more aligned, and ironically, more visible to the very person who is avoiding depth. Not because you changed yourself to be seen, but because you stopped disappearing into them. And at that point, whether they come forward or not is no longer the measure of your value. Because real power in emotional dynamics is not about holding on. It is about standing so firmly in your own truth that you are no longer negotiating your worth with someone else's capacity to recognize it. And once you reach that place, the entire dynamic shifts. Not because you control, them, but because you finally stopped abandoning yourself. And that is where real clarity begins, not in what they feel, but in who you have become without needing them to define it.